Canada's new $500 million rail corridor to Mexico did not shock Washington because it bypassed America. It shocked the old assumption that Canada had no serious alternative. For years, the logic was simple. If Canadian goods moved south, they depended on American ports, American bottlenecks, American rail connections, American inspections, or American political goodwill. But now, a Calgary-based rail giant has changed the map. Canadian Pacific Kansas City, or CPKC, now operates the first single-line railway network linking Canada, the United States, and Mexico under one company. And with more than $500 million invested in modern grain capacity, including thousands of high-capacity hopper cars, Canada's exporters now have a stronger route into Mexico, not around the United States, through the United States, but with fewer handoffs, fewer port dependencies, and less exposure to the old choke points. That is the real story. And it matters because trade power does not live only in what a country produces. It lives in the route that carries it. But this is where many people get the story wrong. Canada did not build a magical railway from Calgary to Mexico City without touching American soil. The trains still cross the United States. US rail rules still matter. Border systems still matter. American territory still sits in the middle. But the strategic shift is this. Canada is learning how to reduce the number of American gates its exports must depend on. That is very different from removing America from the map. And in trade economics, that difference is huge. On April 14, 2023, Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern combined to form CPKC. That merger created something North America had never had before. One railway company with a continuous network linking Canada, the US, and Mexico. Before this, many shipments had to move through several carriers. Cargo could be handed from one railroad to another, adding time, cost, paperwork, and uncertainty. But CPKC changed that structure. A shipment can now move from the Canadian prairies through the US Midwest, down through Kansas City and Texas, across the Nuevo Laredo Gateway, and into Mexican industrial centers like Monterrey, San Luis Potosí, and Mexico City under one rail operator. That does not make the US irrelevant. It changes the US role. Instead of being the final market, the port gatekeeper, and the inspection bottleneck all at once, the US can become more like transit territory for some Canada to Mexico freight. That is why Washington should pay attention. Because Canada is not shouting about independence. It is building optionality. And optionality is how a smaller economy survives beside a larger neighbour. The $500 million part is also important, but it must be understood correctly. This is not simply a government announcement about a brand new railway line. The stronger factual point is that CPKC has invested more than $500 million in high-capacity grain hopper cars and related freight capacity, helping Canadian agriculture move more efficiently across the continent. That sounds technical, but it is not small. Grain does not move because politicians make speeches. Grain moves because rail cars exist, locomotives pull them, crews run the network, terminals load the cargo, border systems process the movement, and buyers trust the delivery schedule. When a railway adds thousands of modern hopper cars, it is not just buying equipment. It is buying capacity, reliability, and bargaining power for exporters. And that capacity is already showing up in the numbers. In May 2026, CPKC said it moved 2.9 million metric tons of Canadian grain and grain products, setting a new May record. By week 43 of the 2025-2026 crop year, it had moved more than 25 million metric tons, its strongest Canadian grain performance since the record-setting 2020-2021 crop year. Not all of that grain is Mexico-bound, and that distinction matters. But the numbers prove the bigger point. This is not just a map, a merger, or a long-term theory. The corridor is already moving real freight at serious scale. And that matters because Mexico is not a minor market. Mexico has more than 130 million people, a growing manufacturing base, expanding food demand, and a central position inside North American trade. For Canada, Mexico is not a replacement for the United States, but it is becoming a more important partner. That is why Canadian grain, oats, wheat, canola products, fertilizer, auto parts, manufactured goods, and industrial cargo moving toward Mexico matter. Every shipment tells the same story. Canada may still need America's geography, but it does not always need America's ports. That is the key. A Canadian grain shipment moving by rail to Mexico may still cross American land, but it does not have to rely on a US port as the main export gate. It does not always need the same old handoffs. It does not always enter US commerce as the final destination. In some cases, cargo can move under customs control through the United States as transit freight. That does not mean Washington has zero power. To exaggerate, some would say America cannot inspect it, slow it, touch it, or regulate it. That is not true. The United States still controls its territory. It still has customs rules, rail safety rules, security procedures, and border authority. But the leverage changes when the US is not the buyer, not the port gatekeeper, and not the only route to market. This is the same lesson we saw with the Gordie Howe Bridge, but from the other side. The bridge showed Canada's vulnerability. Canada could finance a major trade corridor, but the final gate still depended on US cooperation. The CPKC rail network shows Canada's adaptation. Canada cannot remove the US from the continent, but it can reduce the number of choke points where Canadian trade can be squeezed. One story exposes the gate. The other builds alternatives around the gate. And since CPKC became operational, the corridor has only become more serious. The company launched Mexico-focused freight services. It expanded capacity at the Laredo-Nuevo Laredo rail crossing. It strengthened routes for agriculture, intermodal freight, automotive supply chains, and manufactured goods. It turned a merger into an operating trade spine across North America. That is what Washington did not calculate. Canada was not only reacting to one tariff threat or one political fight. It was preparing for a future where American unpredictability may become a permanent cost of doing business. And the answer was not a speech. It was infrastructure, rail cars, terminals, border capacity, locomotives, long-term contracts, a working route into Mexico. This is what modern trade power looks like. Not always confrontation, not always retaliation. Sometimes it is quiet substitution. You do not always defeat the gatekeeper by shouting at the gate. Sometimes you build enough alternatives that the gatekeeper matters less. That is why Canada's new rail corridor to Mexico matters. It does not free Canada from America, but it gives Canada more room to move. And in a world of tariffs, delays, border pressure, and political uncertainty, room to move is power. So the real question is this: is Canada finally building the trade alternatives it should have built decades ago, or is it still too dependent on American-controlled routes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger economic picture, hit the like button, share this video with someone following Canada-US trade tensions, subscribe to Trad Economics, and turn on notifications for more analysis on trade, infrastructure, economics, and geopolitics beyond the headlines.